People think the Suez Canal makes money because ships pay to pass through it. That is true. It is also the least interesting thing about the canal. The real business is much bigger. The Suez Canal is a machine that monetizes geography itself. Takes a piece of desert in Egypt, cuts a narrow line through it, and turns that line into one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure on Earth. A ship does not pay because the canal is luxurious. It pays because the alternative is thousands of extra miles around Africa, fuel, more crew time, more insurance, more ships tied up in transit, and more days before cargo can be sold. The canal is therefore not really selling water. It is selling time. And time in global shipping is money on an almost absurd scale. Why a waterway only about 193 kilometers long can influence the price of oil, containers, food, insurance, freight, and even inflation in countries thousands of miles away. It is also why empires fought over it, why Britain once treated it as a strategic artery of empire, why Egypt eventually nationalized it, why wars repeatedly shut it down, and why a single container ship getting stuck in the canal in 2021 managed to disrupt supply chains around the world. To understand the economics of the Suez Canal, you have to stop thinking of it as a ditch. Think of it as a toll booth placed directly on one of the planet's most important shortcuts. For thousands of years, the economic problem was brutally simple. Europe wanted the wealth of Asia. Asia wanted European goods. And between them sat Africa. Before the modern canal, traveling between Europe and the Indian Ocean had to sail around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That meant turning a regional journey into an enormous maritime loop. The difference was not cosmetic. It changed the economics of entire industries. A ship is an expensive asset that earns money while it carries cargo and loses money while it sits idle. Every additional day at sea means fuel consumption, wages, maintenance, insurance exposure, and capital tied up in transit. So if someone could remove thousands of miles from the route between Europe and Asia, they were not merely building a shortcut. They were creating an economic asset. The ancient Egyptians understood the strategic value of connecting the Mediterranean and Red Sea long before modern shipping existed. Various waterways and canal systems were constructed and abandoned over centuries, often connecting the Nile or its branches with the Red Sea. But the modern Suez Canal was a different proposition. It would connect the Mediterranean directly to the Red Sea. No river detour, no lock system, no need to sail around Africa, just a continuous maritime corridor through Egypt. The man who turned that idea into a commercial project was Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and entrepreneur who secured concessions from Egypt in the 19th century. The first concession was granted in 1854, followed by additional agreements that established the framework for a company to build and operate the canal. And here the economics become fascinating, because the canal was not simply a government construction project. First, it was a private commercial enterprise built around a concession. The original arrangement granted the operating company a concession lasting 99 years from the canal's inauguration, while the Egyptian government was entitled to a share of the company's profits. In other words, Egypt was effectively exchanging access to its geography for future economic participation. The company would provide capital and construction. The state would provide the territory and legal framework. And the investors would receive the right to monetize the resulting transportation corridor. That sounds straightforward. It wasn't. Construction began in 1859 under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Tens of thousands of Egyptian laborers participated in the digging, and the project consumed enormous quantities of labor, equipment, and capital. The Canal Authority records that approximately 74 million cubic meters of soil were excavated, while the execution cost reached about 433 million francs, roughly twice the initial estimate. The first lesson of canal economics. A shortcut may be enormously valuable after it exists, but getting to the point where ships can use it can consume a fortune. The canal finally opened in 1869. At the time, it was roughly 164 kilometers long, dramatically narrower and shallower than the waterway we know today. The economics, however, were already obvious. A ship could now move between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea without circumnavigating Africa. The geography of world trade had been permanently altered. And something even more important happened. The canal created a business with extraordinarily attractive characteristics. Once the infrastructure existed, every additional ship could use it without requiring the canal to be rebuilt from scratch. The marginal cost of allowing another ship through was far lower than the original construction cost. That is a classic infrastructure business. Huge upfront capital expenditure, long operating life, high fixed costs, relatively low marginal cost, and, if demand is strong enough, enormous cash generation. But there was a catch. The canal could not simply charge whatever it wanted. If the toll became too high, ship owners could choose the alternative route around Africa. That alternative was expensive. Still an alternative. This is one of the most important pieces of the Suez business model. The canal does not possess unlimited pricing power. It possesses geographic pricing power. Those are different things. Canal can charge a premium because it saves time and distance, but the ceiling is determined by the economic cost of going around Africa. Imagine a container ship deciding whether to pay a large Suez toll. The ship owner is not asking, "Is this toll expensive?" A much more useful question. Is the toll cheaper than the fuel, time, labor, financing, insurance, and opportunity cost of taking the long route? That calculation is the real price of Suez, and it changes constantly. When fuel prices rise, the canal becomes more valuable. When freight rates rise, time becomes more valuable. When ships become larger, economies of scale change. When insurance premiums rise in the Red Sea, the canal becomes less attractive. When security risks increase, the value of the shortcut can collapse overnight. This is why the economics of the canal are ultimately tied to the economics of global shipping itself. The canal cannot manufacture demand. It monetizes demand that already exists. And as global trade expanded, demand became enormous. The 19th century was also the age of industrialization, steamships, European imperial expansion, and rapidly growing trade between Europe and Asia. The Suez Canal quickly became more than a commercial convenience. It became a strategic artery. Britain in particular understood what the canal meant. The shortest maritime route between Britain and India was no longer a theoretical concept. It became a strategic reality. And that created a strange situation. The canal was physically located in Egypt. The economic and political power surrounding it increasingly belonged to European interests. In 1875, the British government purchased a major block of shares from Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail, for about £3.98 million. Those shares represented roughly 44% of the company's total shares. Think about what that means. Egypt owned the land, but foreign capital increasingly controlled the company operating the shortcut. And the shortcut was becoming one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure on Earth. This is where infrastructure economics becomes power economics. A railway can transport goods, a port can control access, a canal can control a route. And once a route becomes essential, ownership of the infrastructure becomes politically significant. The Suez Canal was therefore never just a business. It was a business sitting on top of a geopolitical choke point. That distinction would eventually explode. But first, the canal had to evolve with the ships using it, because there is another hidden cost in canal economics that is easy to miss. A canal is never finished. The moment you build it, engineers begin planning how to make it deeper, wider, and more efficient. Why? Because ships keep getting bigger. A canal designed for 19th century steamships cannot automatically accommodate 20th century tankers and container ships. If the canal does not expand, ships eventually outgrow it. And if ships outgrow it, infrastructure becomes economically obsolete. So the canal entered a permanent cycle of capital expenditure. Dredging, deepening, widening, nonification improvements. New equipment, new channels, new control systems. Generation of ships forced the canal to spend more money to remain useful. Before nationalization in 1956, development programs had already increased the canal's depth, width, water cross-section, and permitted draft substantially. Suez Canal Authority records that improvements during this period cost more than 20.5 million Egyptian pounds. That is the second lesson. Karfok does not merely require money to build, it requires money to stay relevant. And the bigger the ships become, the larger the economic incentive to keep the shortcut open. This produces a feedback loop. More global trade creates more ships. More ships create demand for larger ships. Larger ships create demand for deeper canals. Deeper canals require more capital. Canals support even more trade. And the infrastructure becomes more valuable because the world becomes increasingly dependent on it. But dependence has a darker side. The more important a choke point becomes, the more dangerous it becomes to control. 20th century, Suez was no longer just an Egyptian asset or a British commercial interest. It was part of the architecture of global power. Then came the moment when the economic ownership of the canal collided directly with the politics of sovereignty. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. The British and French governments were furious. Nasser's government argued that Egypt would take control while compensating shareholders, and the nationalization decree transferred the company's assets and obligations to the Egyptian state. But beneath the political drama was a remarkably simple economic idea. Why should foreigners capture the profits from a strategic Egyptian asset located on Egyptian territory? Nasser had another reason. Egypt wanted to finance development, particularly the Aswan High Dam. and the canal represented a source of hard currency revenue that the Egyptian state could control directly. Contemporary U.S. diplomatic records note that Nasser explicitly connected the canal's revenues with Egypt's ability to finance the dam. This changed the business model permanently. The canal stopped being a private concession controlled primarily by foreign shareholders. It became a state-owned revenue machine, and that model still exists. Today, the Suez Canal Authority operates the waterway as an independent public authority. It manages, operates, maintains, and develops the canal, and it collects tolls for navigation, pilotage, towage, and related services. This is where the canal becomes especially interesting from an investment perspective. Imagine owning an asset that sits between two oceans, has almost no direct competitor offering the same geographic shortcut, has existed for more than 150 years, used by vessels carrying energy, raw materials, food, machinery, and consumer products. It sounds almost unbeatable, but there is one word that destroys the illusion: choke point. A choke point does not only concentrate economic value, it concentrates risk. Suez Canal has been closed by war before. In 1956, the canal was shut during the Suez Crisis and reopened in 1957 after the waterway was cleared. Then came a much larger shock. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the canal closed again, and this time it stayed closed for years. The waterway became a front line. Ships were trapped, wrecks blocked navigation, commercial traffic disappeared. The canal's economics went from enormous revenue to effectively zero transit revenue. That is the nightmare scenario for any infrastructure owner. The asset is still physically there, the demand still exists, the customers still need the route, but if politics prevents access, the revenue machine stops. The canal finally reopened to international navigation in June 1975 after years of closure and extensive clearance work. It tells us something crucial. The biggest threat to the Suez Canal has never been another canal. It has been the world around the canal: wars, political instability, security, insurance, oil prices, global recessions, shipping cycles, and eventually, structure of global supply chains themselves. Because a canal's value is not determined by how much cargo exists. It is determined by how much cargo wants to travel through that particular corridor. This is where the Suez business becomes almost like a giant real-time auction. Every shipping company is constantly comparing routes: Suez versus Cape of Good Hope, shorter distance versus lower security risk, higher toll versus lower fuel consumption, faster delivery versus cheaper insurance. There is no permanent answer. The economics move every day. A modern container ship can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars when fully loaded and represents a huge amount of capital in motion. The longer it spends at sea, the longer that capital remains tied up. A shipping company also doesn't simply own ships. It operates schedules. A vessel arriving late in Rotterdam can affect port slots, trucking schedules, warehouse inventories, factory production, and the next voyage. Saving several days can have an economic value much larger than the fuel saved by the shorter route. That is why the canal can charge tolls that look enormous when viewed from the perspective of a single voyage. The shipowner is not buying passage, buying a reduction in total voyage cost. And the canal's pricing strategy can therefore be thought of as capturing a portion of the value it creates. This is the essence of the business. Create savings for the customer. Capture part of those savings as revenue. The bigger the savings, the greater the potential toll, but there is a limit. If Egypt captures too much of the benefit, ships can leave, and history has shown that they can. The clearest example arrived not from an economic recession, but from a security crisis. Beginning in late 2023, attacks on shipping in the Red Sea caused major shipping companies to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. The economic consequences were enormous. UN Trade and Development reported that Suez traffic plunged sharply, while rerouting around Africa added roughly 12 days to some Asia-Europe journeys. That is extraordinary. The canal itself did not disappear. The water was still there. The route was still shorter. The infrastructure was still operational. But the perceived risk of reaching it changed, and that was enough to redirect global shipping. This is the hidden dependency behind Suez. The canal depends on the Red Sea. The Red Sea depends on regional security. Regional security depends on geopolitics. Geopolitics can change faster than infrastructure can. You can spend billions improving a canal. You cannot dredge away a war. The numbers make the impact even clearer. By mid-2024, UNCTAD reported that Suez traffic had fallen by more than half from its previous peak, while rerouting around Africa had surged. The additional distance increased fuel consumption, crew costs, insurance, vessel demand, and emissions. And this created a fascinating paradox. When ships stopped using the canal, the economic cost was not limited to Egypt. Egypt lost canal revenue, But the shipping industry also lost capacity. A ship that takes longer to complete a voyage is a ship that cannot begin its next voyage as quickly. So global shipping effectively needs more ships to move the same amount of cargo. Had estimated that rerouting increased global vessel demand by about 3% and container ship demand by about 12%, compared with a world in which ships could continue using the Suez route normally. The Suez Canal is doing something much more important than saving distance. It increases the productivity of the world's existing fleet. A shorter route effectively makes every ship available for more productive work. Is why a canal can influence freight rates, even when the canal itself does not own a single container. It changes the supply of shipping capacity. And when shipping capacity falls, prices rise. That is exactly what happened. UNCTAD reported major increases in container freight rates during the Red Sea disruption, including sharp increases on routes connecting Asia with Europe. Suddenly, the economics of a canal became visible to ordinary consumers. A canal disruption could eventually become a higher shipping bill. A higher shipping bill could become a higher import cost. A higher import cost could become higher prices, and higher prices could feed inflation. The chain looked like this. A security threat in the Red Sea. Ships avoid Suez. Voyages become longer. Effective shipping capacity falls. Freight rates rise. Midpoint costs rise. Businesses pass some costs forward. Consumers eventually pay more. The canal was not selling containers. Its absence could influence the price of products inside those containers. That is what makes choke point infrastructure so powerful. Its economic value extends far beyond its own balance sheet. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of the canal. People often ask how much money the Suez Canal makes. That is the obvious question. The better question is how much economic value the canal creates. Those are not the same number. The canal's direct revenue is collected through tolls and related services. Economic value created by the shortcut is spread across shipping companies, ports, manufacturers, exporters, importers, insurers, energy traders, logistics firms, retailers, and consumers. The canal captures only a fraction of that total value. Imagine a ship that saves 10 days and thousands of miles by using Suez. The Canal Authority might collect a toll worth hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, depending on the vessel and cargo. But the total value created could be much larger. The ship reaches port earlier. The cargo reaches factories sooner. The ship can begin another voyage sooner. Fuel consumption falls. Crew time falls. Capital is released sooner and quantity arrives sooner. The entire logistics chain becomes faster. The canal monetizes only one slice of that improvement. This is why infrastructure businesses can be extraordinarily profitable without capturing the entire economic value they create. A bridge doesn't need to charge drivers the full value of arriving at work. Of animals. A railway doesn't need to capture the entire productivity of a factory worker who arrives on time. A canal doesn't need to capture the full commercial value of global trade. It only needs to capture enough of the savings to make the infrastructure enormously valuable. Suez has become very good at that. From 2019 through 2024, the Suez Canal Authority reported nearly $40 billion in cumulative revenue. But that revenue did not come from simply opening a gate and collecting money. The authority has to maintain dredging fleets, navigation systems, pilots, tugboats, infrastructure, communications, emergency capabilities, and increasingly sophisticated traffic management. The canal is an industrial system. Every vessel represents operational risk. A ship can suffer mechanical failure. A vessel can run aground. A collision can block the channel. A storm can reduce visibility. A tanker can create an environmental disaster. A large container ship can become a floating wall. And the larger the ships become, the more expensive mistakes become. Is another hidden cost. Scale creates revenue. Scale also creates catastrophic downside. The 2021 grounding of the Ever Given demonstrated this perfectly. A single ship blocked the canal and turned an invisible piece of infrastructure into the center of global attention. For several days, the world's logistics system watched one vessel sitting sideways in a narrow waterway. The lesson was not simply that ships can get stuck. The lesson was that modern supply chains had become extraordinarily dependent on a single corridor. Just-in-time manufacturing, low inventories, highly concentrated shipping networks, massive container vessels, and synchronized ports had created efficiency. But efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. A system optimized for minimum cost can become fragile when one link breaks. The Suez Canal did not create that fragility by itself. Global business created it by continuously optimizing around the cheapest and fastest routes. And that is why the canal's economics are ultimately inseparable from a much larger story about globalization. For decades, companies increasingly separated production across continents. Component could be made in one country, assembled in another, packaged in a third, sold somewhere thousands of miles away. The economic logic was powerful. Produce where labor is cheaper. Source materials where they are abundant. Manufacture at scale, ship cheaply, hold minimal inventory, repeat. The Suez Canal became one of the arteries connecting those decisions, but the moment the artery becomes unreliable, the economics begin to reverse. Companies start asking whether saving a few cents in manufacturing cost is worth adding thousands of miles of supply chain exposure. They ask whether inventories should increase. They ask whether factories should move closer to customers. They ask whether suppliers should be diversified. And suddenly, a canal in Egypt becomes part of the strategic conversation inside boardrooms in Europe, Asia, and America. Is the deeper economic importance of Suez. It is not just infrastructure, it is an assumption. The assumption that ships can move predictably between Asia and Europe. When that assumption holds, companies build business models around it. When it breaks, entire industries have to recalculate. And the canal itself has had to evolve in response. In 2015, Egypt inaugurated the new Suez Canal project, dramatically expanding portions of the waterway and improving navigation capacity. The objective was not merely to make the canal physically larger. It was to make the business more efficient. More ships, shorter waiting times, greater reliability, more capacity, more potential revenue. This is the logic of infrastructure competition. Even when there is no direct substitute, customers still compare alternatives. If Suez becomes congested, Cape routes become more attractive. If tolls become too high, longer routes become more competitive. If security deteriorates, insurance can overwhelm the savings. If shipping technology changes, the economics can change with it. So the canal cannot sit still. It has to continually reinvest. And that creates a delicate balance. Spend too little, and the canal becomes obsolete. Spend too much, and capital returns fall. Charge too little, Egypt leaves money on the table. Charge too much, and shipping companies look elsewhere. Prioritize maximum traffic, and toll revenue per vessel may suffer. Prioritize maximum tolls, and traffic may decline. That is the real optimization problem. Not how much should we charge, but how much of the economic value created by the shortcut can we capture without destroying the incentive to use it? This is a classic pricing problem disguised as geography. And there is another complication. The ships are getting larger. That sounds like good news. A giant container vessel can carry enormous amounts of cargo through one transit. But large ships also demand greater depth, greater maneuvering space, stronger navigation systems, and more sophisticated emergency capabilities. So the canal's future depends partly on the evolution of ships it does not control. That is a dangerous position for infrastructure. You own the road, but someone else decides how big the trucks become. If the trucks grow faster than the road, you have to spend money. Stop growing. Some of your planned expansion may never generate the expected return. The Suez Canal therefore lives inside a continuous technological arms race between infrastructure and shipping. And then there is the question of competition. The Cape of Good Hope is not a canal. It does not charge a toll. It is simply ocean. That makes it the ultimate alternative. The problem is that the ocean is enormous. A ship going around Africa may need thousands of additional nautical miles compared with Suez. It means more fuel, more time, more crew hours, more exposure to weather, more insurance risk, more capital tied up, more emissions. UNCTAD found that rerouting around Africa can add roughly 12 days to a Shanghai to Rotterdam voyage and can significantly increase vessel demand and operating costs. So the canal possesses something economists dream about. A competitor exists. But the competitor is dramatically worse under normal conditions. That is why the canal has such powerful economics. Yet normal conditions are the key phrase. Because when risk becomes high enough, customers will pay the price of inefficiency. They will burn more fuel. They will add more days. They will accept higher costs. They will do almost anything to avoid a route they perceive as unsafe. That is why the recent Red Sea crisis was such a powerful demonstration of the canal's vulnerability. It showed that the canal's moat is not physical. The waterway itself is difficult to replicate, but the economic decision to use it can change instantly. That is a subtle but enormous distinction. You cannot easily build another Suez Canal, but you can choose not to use this one. And that means the canal's most valuable asset is not the trench, it is trust. Trust that the route is open. Trust that ships can pass safely. Trust that schedules will hold. Trust that insurance will remain manageable. Trust that the political environment will not suddenly turn the shortcut into a liability. When that trust exists, the canal becomes a cash machine. When that trust disappears, the same physical infrastructure can become almost irrelevant. Is why the Suez Canal has survived wars, empire, nationalization, technological revolutions, gigantic ships, and global supply chain transformations. Its value is not based on one country's political ideology. It is based on something more durable: distance. For the planet has not become smaller, but the economic penalty for distance has become enormous. A factory in China can serve customers in Europe because ships can cross the world cheaply. Oil produced in the Middle East can reach European markets through a maritime system built around choke points. Asian manufactured goods can reach Mediterranean ports without circling an entire continent. Food, machinery, chemicals, electronics, clothing, vehicles, and energy can all move through the same geographic shortcut. The canal is therefore a physical manifestation of globalization. And globalization has a price. The more the world depends on long-distance trade, the more valuable its shortcuts become. But the more valuable those shortcuts become, the more vulnerable the system becomes to disruption. That is the paradox. Efficiency creates value. Efficiency also creates concentration. Concentration creates dependence. Dependence creates strategic vulnerability. Strategic vulnerability creates political power. This is why governments care so much about canals. A canal can look like infrastructure, but in reality, it is a lever. Egypt can earn foreign currency from it. Shipping companies can reduce costs through it, can receive Asian goods faster because of it. Energy markets can depend on its availability. And militaries care about it because commercial geography and military geography are never completely separate. Suez Canal is one of those rare assets where economics and geopolitics become almost impossible to distinguish. That is why its history contains so many moments when a toll road became a battlefield. And that is why its future will never be determined by economics alone. The canal can be perfectly dredged. Its navigation systems can be state-of-the-art. Its toll schedule can be carefully optimized. Its capacity can be expanded. But if the Red Sea becomes dangerous, ships may still turn away. If global trade slows, traffic falls. Oil prices collapse, route economics change. If shipping companies redesign their networks, demand changes. If climate or geopolitical shocks alter alternative routes, the value of Suez changes again. The canal is therefore an extraordinary business, precisely because it sits at the intersection of forces it cannot control. It monetizes global commerce without owning global commerce. It profits from shipping without owning the ships. From globalization without manufacturing a single product, and it captures the value of something that sounds almost too simple to be an economic asset. A shorter route. That may be the deepest lesson of the Suez Canal. The most valuable businesses do not always sell products. Sometimes they remove friction, they remove distance, they remove waiting, they remove uncertainty. And when the friction being removed exists across the entire global economy, even a narrow strip of water can become worth billions. But there is one final twist. The Suez Canal is often described as a shortcut between Europe and Asia. That is geographically correct. Economically, it is incomplete. The canal is not really a shortcut between two places. It is a shortcut between two entire economic systems. On one side are factories, energy producers, commodity exporters, and manufacturing networks. On the other are consumers, industrial economies, ports, warehouses, retailers, and financial markets. The canal sits between them and charges for making that relationship faster. That is why its value is so much greater than the concrete, dredged earth, navigation equipment, and water it contains. The physical canal is only the machine. The real asset is the global dependency built around it. And dependency is what turns geography into power. A ship entering Suez is making a calculation. The toll is worth paying because the alternative is worse. That calculation has been repeated millions of times since 1869. Generated enormous revenues. It has shaped empires, it has financed states, it has triggered wars, it has redirected fleets, it has influenced inflation. And when the route becomes dangerous, it discovers just how much it was quietly relying on a narrow corridor through the Egyptian desert. That is the strange economics of the Suez Canal. It does not become valuable because the canal is expensive to build. It becomes valuable because the world is expensive to move through without it. And that distinction explains almost everything. The canal's greatest asset is not water. It is the distance it eliminates. Its greatest source of revenue is not the ship. The time the ship saves. Its greatest competitive advantage is not that alternatives do not exist. It is that the alternatives are painfully inefficient, and its greatest vulnerability is not another canal. The possibility that the world decides the shortcut is no longer worth the risk. For more than a century and a half, the Suez Canal has converted geography into cash. But the deeper truth is even more powerful. It has converted geography into leverage. And as long as global trade continues to depend on moving enormous quantities of goods between distant continents, that narrow line through Egypt will remain one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure on the planet. Because sometimes the greatest economic asset is not what you produce. It is what you make everyone else unable to ignore.